Hi, I'm John Stemmel, Associate Director of the Health Communication Research Center. It's my pleasure to introduce Gary Schwitzer, publisher of healthnewsreview.org. Gary has specialized in healthcare journalism for the last 30 years in a career that spans television, teaching, and the internet. In his current role with healthnewsreview.org, Gary leads a team of more than 24 people who grade daily health news by reporting daily health news reporting by major U.S. news organizations. In its first year, the project was honored with several journalism industry awards. The Mirror Award, honoring those who hold a mirror to their own industry for the public's benefit, and the Knight Batten Award for innovations in journalism. I first met him when he joined the University of Minnesota School of Journalism and Mass Communication as a professor in 2001. At the time, he had just left the Mayo Clinic and his position as founding editor-in-chief of the mayoclinic.com consumer website. Through his various stops, from the American Heart Association to television medical news at CNN and network affiliates in Atlanta, Dallas, and Milwaukee, to his continued involvement with the Association of Healthcare Journalists, based here in Missouri at the Missouri School of Journalism, he has always remained true to the journalistic standards of truth and accuracy in reporting. Please welcome Gary.
Thank you, John, and thanks all of you for having me. This is my first trip to Columbia. Buckle up because I have a lot I want to cover. I've come a long way to share it with you and really welcome the opportunity. So, you know, from the program, this is what I'm going to talk about: too good to be true, healthcare reform stories that we actually don't hear that much about. This is what you'll be hearing from me today. My concerns and those of many others about really this fire hose of health information that we flood the American public with every day. They're thirsty for just a sip, and we flood them ineffectively with this fire hose of information. So while I'm going to talk mostly about news, we may not have a journalist in the crowd. I want to say to you that I think these same messages are relevant for you if you work in advertising, in web health education information, if you or your organization produce news releases from industry, from academic medical centers, from health departments. And if I forget to remind you throughout, my question to you throughout should be, what have you done to work with local media or to improve your own communications efforts? And I just added this last bullet after I heard Uwe raise this important question because I think it jives with a lot of what I'll be talking about. Where has civic education failed in all of these areas? So I know that in a healthcare talk, I've been around this industry for a long time, you should always have a disclosure slide. I have two disclosures. My work is currently supported by the Foundation for Informed Medical Decision Making based in Boston. This was founded by Jack Wenberg, the Dartmouth Small Area Variations research pioneer, and colleagues back about 20 years ago. That's my first disclosure. The second disclosure is that I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore, like Howard Beale from the movie Network was. And this is the scene setter for why I'm mad as hell. I'm glad to have somebody else raise this at a meeting of the Association of Healthcare Journalists a couple of years ago. So this is a Pulitzer Prize winner who I think shocked the crowd in a room this big or bigger, saying, you know, we've never had better investigative healthcare journalism, even in small and medium-sized papers in this country, but these once or twice or three times a year peaks of excellence don't make up for the valleys in between that are getting wider and deeper. Healthcare reporting, he said, the daily drumbeat is a disgrace. There aren't any breakthroughs. That should be the next paragraph in the story when anyone makes such a claim. So that's that's my mindset, and that's behind this effort that I've now been publishing for 5 years. And this team of about 24 people that John described includes physician, faculty members from places you may have heard of like Harvard, Duke, Hopkins, UNC, UCLA, UCSF. We have RN, PhD, MPH researchers and 4 other journalist reviewers in addition to myself. And I wish I could have told Uwe, I was just in Germany last month consulting with a German team that is about to launch a German version of Health News Review. I think they go live next week. So all we review, but we've now reviewed more than 1,200 stories, are stories that include claims of efficacy or safety in new stuff. So some kind of intervention, treatment, test, product, procedure, dietary approach, you name it. I say only in quotes because that's probably the majority of stories and I think the most dangerous stories that we get. When you look every day, as I do, you see some incredible things. So in one recent week, we saw 2 stories that used pharma VPs as their main source, one of them getting away with predicting a breakthrough without giving any data, one of them based solely on a news release on mouse research, one of them, this was cataract research, they took cataracts out of the body, zapped them with some form of radiation out of the, and the story said the treatment worked. So this is truly an out-of-body experience, I guess. And another story anointed a cancer gene therapy as a breakthrough after it had been tested on just 3 tumor samples. Uwe's question, where has civic education failed? Now, were these in a student newspaper? No. That, and that. That's where these stories came from. That is not journalism. That's cheerleading. Now, when it comes to coverage of medical devices, we might as well be in Toys R Us. So we now have, and this is growing by pairs across the country, because when one medical center gets proton beam radiation equipment, it always comes in pairs because a competing center does so. And so when the Columbus Dispatch in Columbus, Ohio had a story about this unfortunate, the way they labeled it, Central Ohio man who had to go all the way to Florida to get proton beam therapy, but lo and behold, happy punchline to the story, there's now plans to build 2 proton beam facilities in Columbus, Ohio. Now, that's what the story told you. What it didn't tell you were the incredible institutional costs and setup costs, the incredible patient charges, the very important questions about evidence of efficacy and safety from this approach, and no discussion of resource allocation or how many of these we need in the world, in the U.S., in the Midwest, in Ohio, or in Columbus. Now, it doesn't take the New York Times to do this. If you just apply the same healthy skepticism that you do in any form of journalism, you could do what the Times did in getting an expert to say that this reflects the best, potentially, and the worst of this non-system that we have. And if you turn to say, here's a chairman of radiation oncology at Michigan, there aren't any data that this is any better than what we're already doing with radiation. That ought to be in every story about these new technologies. Now, hope I don't offend anyone. I think there's something phallic going on with baseball and prostate cancer. You know, bats and balls, and we get this all the time. This was from a program, my dad just turned 90 last week, and when he was a mere 88, I took him to a spring training game in Florida, and he's cheaper than I am. He made me buy the program, which was filled with medical ads. All I needed was the little scorecard insert, which could have been free from some kid on the street. So he made me buy the program, and it was a boring game, and I'm reading through all these ads, and this one jumped out at me, and they're bragging about IMRT radiation, which is the little sister of proton beam. And again, I just want you to think of the overall fire hose of not just news, but advertising and all the other messages that people get. I'm driving around an interstate in a freeway around the Twin Cities where I live, and this jumps out at me, and I'm thinking, I had to pull over and take the picture because I'm thinking, who's this for? Well, is this for me or for the woman in the car in front of me who I almost hit as I pulled over? It must be for all of us who want to be this sort of androgynous, glowing skeleton here. And this is what we get with healthcare marketing. These were actual newspaper headlines that I found in just a couple of seconds doing a Google search on Da Vinci robotic surgery. Real headlines. Robot doctor surgery of tomorrow. You know what? I don't want any magical touch on my prostate. Life-saving surgical robot. The robot's hands never tremble. This is cute, isn't it? Code for faster recovery. It's another cute one, surgery. The last one's the one that comes closest to the truth. You know, and again, I fly through Google, and I pride myself in how quickly you can find something. So you just look up evidence for prostate cancer interventions, and it doesn't take long to get an evidence-based answer that we don't have evidence for this whole alphabet soup of stuff. Whether it's freezing it, scoping it, roboting it, hormoning it, ultrasounding it, proton IMRTing it, we don't have the evidence, but look at that bottom line. The train has left the station. Emerging technologies, despite the absence of, well, that's quite euphemistic. And you know, once that high-speed, high-tech, unproven train leaves the station, there's no pulling it back. And this is why I have become Howard Beale, mad as hell, and now trying to do something about it. In a simplistic overview, this is what we get too much of in the left column in a minute and what we don't get enough of in the right. So too many stories about cures, breakthroughs, miracles. Journalists gave me these terms of what they're forced to do in their own newsrooms. Too many light, fluffy, feel-good, consumer health news you can use stories with unquestioning awe over claims that are made. And especially on the business page, it seems, where there just seems to be a different set of journalistic ethics where we do cheerlead about anyone in our local medical center or in our local industry. But while doing all these, we don't get enough stories about questioning the claims, investigating the evidence, helping consumers become healthier skeptics, reporting on costs, disparities, access, alternative options, helping consumers navigate this non-system that we have, and looking at conflicts of interest in the sources of these stories that they tell. So you might say, all right, cut your rant. Well, come on, what's the harm in this? Well, there is incredible harm. And this is my theme of 2010, is to remind journalists, but I'm reminding all of you as communicators, the harm that you can do, even though it's unintended and it's not malicious, with imbalanced, incomplete, inaccurate messages. Such stories as we've just briefly talked about whip the worried well into a frenzy, raise unrealistic expectations of the healthcare system, promote undue demand of costly, unproven technologies that in the end, when we do have evidence, may produce more harm than good. And I would suggest to you that communication of these issues alone is a serious health policy issue in this country. And so, like the story of the Trojan horse, I'd suggest that stories about wonderful healthcare gifts from industry are not what they appear to be. Barry Kramer of the National Cancer Institute does a lot to help train journalists, and he put this phrase, shibboleths, in my head a long time ago. I don't know if anybody in the crowd knows what it is, but this is what it is. It's a catchword, sort of a password that serves a member to identify a member of a group, a cult, or a sect. And this is a pet theme of mine, that in healthcare journalism, and maybe in all of healthcare communication, a common shibboleth is the almost cult-like advocacy for screening tests beyond the boundaries of evidence. That's what I'm talking about. When you promote screening tests beyond the boundaries of evidence, almost as if to suggest that the American public must search for the weapons of mass destruction that are inside all of us, and to lay a guilt trip on anyone who's still healthy because you haven't looked hard enough. You may remember I think it was a JAMA editorial years ago called "The Last Well Person." The punchline was, he just hadn't been worked up enough. In this arena, the worst, most biased coverage I've ever seen, it still sickens me, we're almost at the one-year anniversary, was when the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force released its recommendations new recommendations on breast cancer screening, with special focus on the recommendations for women in their 40s. These were things that I saw more than one time in news stories, that it's all about saving money. And these were things that weren't challenged in these stories. So they were allowed to just sit out there. And when we hear Uwe ask, where has civic education failed? As a journalist, I look in the mirror and say, these big trial balloons were not challenged. Saving money, it's about rationing. It's the first sign of Obamacare. It's government deciding some lives don't matter. Early detection always saves lives. The fact that I or someone I know was saved by a mammogram proves that more testing is better. That these shifting recommendations prove that scientists are clueless, that this was surprising and came out of nowhere, that since the task force members don't include any radiation therapist or oncologist, they must be uninformed idiots. And since the American Cancer Society disagreed with the task force must be wrong. Well, this is what the task force wrote when the recommendations were published last November in the Annals of Internal Medicine. And I want you to focus on how onerous that clause in yellow is. What a sign of cost-cutting, rationing, big government, Obamacare, throwing women under the bus, blah, blah, blah. This is what that evidence-based group wrote. And anyone who said any of those 10 prior things that I just had on screen and isn't going to back them up with evidence, I think that we cannot vilify them enough. This is this group of uninformed idiots. I know several of them personally. No, there is not a radiation therapist or an oncologist in the group, and frankly, because of the potential vested interest, I might be troubled if there were. These are evidence-based people, health services research people who donate their time, barely get their expenses covered. Do you want to know the stack of evidence they go through? Do you think this is a holiday for them? They do it for the American public and for better informed and shared decision-making. And anyone that has any evidence about these people being in the hip pocket of government or serving on the Obama for President re-election campaign, I would challenge them to come forward or forever hold their peace. But that's the kind of fear-mongering that we get and the kind of political rhetoric. Yet, back to journalism, this is what network television reporters Tim Johnson and Jennifer Aniston, this is some of what I put up there were what these people said. Sanjay Gupta, his non-physician colleague Elizabeth Cohen, crossed the line from journalism into advocacy, didn't label it as such, and injected their own opinions against the task force recommendations. And so did, we've got this little gang going on at the Washington Post, columnists Howard Kurtz and Dana Milbank, and Karen Tumulty was at Time, but she wrote against it, and she's now joined the Post. So they've got a nice little club they're growing there. This guy's been at the business longer than I have, and he wrote in The Atlantic, there are a lot of reasons women are ill-informed about breast cancer. Their docs, the cancer establishment, and the news media, especially the news media. Until news of breast cancer rises above the level of scary warnings, mixed with heartwarming anecdotes of cancer survivors, women are likely to go on being perplexed. Now, something's going on that doesn't get any attention at all, and this troubles me. So in the new healthcare reform law, Time magazine reports that what is covered and what is promoted will be determined in preventive services by the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. Well, you should already catch the drift. That is simply inaccurate and misleading, because it was a year ago that the task force recommended against routinely providing mammograms to women in their 40s. But the Department of Health and Human Services ignored it, overruled that recommendation, and it's quite clear that they caved into political pressure from people like Senator David Vitter of Louisiana. So, While we made a big thing about hanging an asterisk after Roger Maris's record when he hit the 61st home run, because it took him more games to do it than it took Babe Ruth, I would suggest that we need to have an asterisk after the health care reform law where we make clear that we really just promote the evidence that agrees with public opinion. The irony is that the same week this year that the law went into effect, there was this Norwegian study in the New England Journal that raised important new questions about the benefit of mammography, accompanied by an editorial. But a week later, when a Swedish paper reported a benefit of mammography in the Journal of the American Cancer Society, we get things like this, and this is a very good reporter, and she probably didn't write the headline, somebody else does that, but notice it says, the Swedish study refutes U.S. advice. Well, pull out your dictionary. Refute means to prove to be wrong or false or disprove. But see, this is how we whip the worried well into a frenzy, and we whip non-controversies into controversies. In that fourth paragraph of that same story, the story says, this study had major limitations and cannot, not may not, cannot account for possibly big differences in the groups it compared. An LA Times story, critics charged the study was poorly designed and potentially vastly misleading. Second sentence of the New York Times story, results were greeted with skepticism by some experts who say they may have overestimated the benefit. That Swedish study was a deeply flawed study. Then we have the arguably inconsistent stances of the American Cancer Society when you look at various screening tests. So they oppose the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force analysis on breast cancer recommendations, but they raise questions, serious questions, about prostate cancer screening for which the evidence is not only quite similar, it is arguably less convincing, more convincing, rather. So what you have at play here is, and when you peel this back to a year ago, the American Cancer Society has a very strong, well-funded public relations arm. There isn't any public relations arm for these volunteers who volunteer their time for the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. So public relations won the day and ruled the newspapers and ruled the airwaves a year ago. This is this fire hose of information. So, is your head spinning yet? Think, what are our readers supposed to make of this? Uwe's question, where has civic education failed? On and on and on again. Across the country, when you do what I do, you see examples in media, leading organizations. Upper right there, there's this neurologist that drives around Manhattan with an MRI van to do brain scans. Paul Goldberg, a friend of mine who edits the Cancer Letter, wrote, you'd have to have your head examined in order to have your head examined. TV loves prostate cancer screening promotions. New York Daily News on lower left, this is now a 10-year-old program. Here they were bragging in their 9th year about bringing in 140,000 men for these free tests. What do you think the quality of shared decision-making and informed decision-making was before any of those 140,000 men rolled up their sleeve for that always labeled as simple blood test? How many false positives, how many biopsies, how many did they find? How many did they find that they really never needed to know about? You're never going to hear that, though. And of course, Katie Couric's using the national television platform years ago when she was not in a demographic for which there's any evidence of annual colonoscopy screening. She had no family history of colon cancer. She was in her 40s. I'm sorry. I am legitimately sorry. I worked with Katie once. We've had communication since. I'm sorry her husband died. But your mate does not confer colon cancer risk on you, from the best of the literature I've seen. She abused the national television platform for screening promotion outside the boundaries of evidence. Let me be consistent that that's what I'm talking about. So this quote is one of my favorites. It's attributed to Mark Twain. I wish I could take credit for it. I love it in regards to screening tests, that it ain't what people don't know that worries me. It's what they know that just ain't so. And so when we see on Larry King, and thank God he's retiring, that Michael Milken and John McEnroe and some unknown urologist, they just know that screening makes sense. It's intuitive. And they easily whip the worried well into a frenzy, but the problem is what they know just ain't so. And there's never a discussion of shared decision-making at times like this. One of our medical editors who works with us on story reviews said to me, Gary, here's your challenge. Start to get journalists to tell the flip side of this screening story, which is equally true, and that is all screening tests cause harm. Some may do good along the way. But see, this is consistent in health journalism and in much of health communication. We emphasize benefits. And I've heard open-minded physicians say this, that we do it in healthcare as well in our communication. We overstate the benefits and we minimize the harms. And we have to do a better job on this. This is disease-mongering in this case. This is selling sickness. Now, there are other forms of disease-mongering, medicalizing a normal state of health. I noticed yesterday and today I wore the same sport coat, and I have the disease of dandruff. If I bent over, I'm starting to get the disease of baldness, although despite all this hair, I am getting a little spot here. I probably have the disease of toenail fungus. That's medicalizing a normal, but we do it in far more serious things. When we turn surrogate endpoints, for example, surrogate markers into diseases unto themselves, instead of educating the public about outcomes we should really care about, exaggerating the seriousness or prevalence of a condition, searching for weapons of mass destruction in all of us, the increasing evidence that overtesting leads to overtreatment, which is why we spend 17% of the GDP on health care, double any other country on the face of the earth, and still leave a magic 17% of the population uncovered. This is a key public health issue, health policy issue. This is a very disturbing paper that appeared recently in Health Affairs. Evidence that consumers are skeptical about evidence-based health care. And just one of their summaries, the beliefs that surfaced in both the qualitative research and the survey, the belief that more is better, newer is better, you get what you pay for, guidelines limit my doctor's ability to provide me with the care I need and deserve. These beliefs are deeply rooted and widespread. Uwe's question, where has civic education failed? This task is immense. We are simply not educating healthcare consumers, and on the eve of another important election, with what you've already heard and what I'm about to show you, I want you to think about how we are not informing people to go into the voting booth. So, our website, Health News Review, we apply. This is about as pure and objective a process as we could come up with. It's not perfect, but it's the best that we've found. We apply 10 criteria to the review of every story. These are the big three, and I'll come back to these in a minute. So, this wonderful new thing you're talking about, what's it cost? How often do benefits occur? Give us some scope. How often do harms occur? And we hold the bar really high. If benefits and harms are discussed and quantified, but in relative terms, relative risk reduction, we give it an unsatisfactory. Because we think, as Paul Harvey would say, give me the rest of the story. You must give absolute risk reduction figures. So, does the story seem to have a grasp that a single case study doesn't hold the same power as a randomized clinical trial? Is there disease mongering? Is this really a new approach, or is this a story about the eighth new erectile dysfunction drug we'll see advertised on the Super Bowl? Is it available, or is this a phase 1 drug trial and you made it sound like it's already at the corner drugstore? Are there alternative choices? Did you put the new idea into the context of what's already tried and true? Who's promoting this? Did you have an independent source? And did you look at financial conflict of interest in the source? Because it's shocking how many times this is not done. Well, here is the data after 4.5 years. We'll have our 5th anniversary in April, and more than 1,200 stories. Put them all up there. So about 70% of the time, we don't discuss costs in these stories. 1,200 stories. And this is almost always 3 different reviewers. So one of these docs I told you about, or a nurse, or somebody with a PhD, or Masters of Public Health, and I'm always the 3rd reviewer, because I believe it or not, despite what you've just heard, I try to always inject balance and fairness, but I really mean that seriously, because we'll go nowhere if we don't get the attention of journalists, and we think this site is used by, we know it is, and very usable for consumers to learn how to evaluate evidence. And so I try to eliminate any rancorous terms. You should see what some of these docs write in their reviews. I have to pull out a really stiff red pen. I'd like to let it go through because they get mad as hell as well. But so you see the numbers here. And the big ones for me are that with costs, benefits, and harms being done so poorly, we now have a very clear data-driven mirror that we can hold up to editorial decision makers across the country and to say this is what you're doing and what you're not doing, and you're given a kid in the candy store view of U.S. healthcare, where most days you're making most things look terrific, risk-free, and without a price tag. So, you caregivers, I want you to I know you see these people coming into your offices, waving articles with these unrealistic expectations. You citizens, think about your fellow citizens who buy this load of bull every day, accept it, and they're going to be voting next week. An example of how we give an unsatisfactory grade on costs. So here was a story about GlaxoSmithKline seeking new approval for a drug for metastatic breast cancer. They mentioned that it was Tykerb. I'll come back to that. Now, this was April of 2009. Just a sidebar for a moment. See this date line? This was March, just a month earlier, and the same drug company had already asked the Comparative Effectiveness Agency in the UK for approval and got rejected. Don't you think that would have been an important part of the story? But it was never mentioned. But I'm here to talk about costs. Now, I told you they only mentioned Tykerb. It was then, and I don't know if it's still the case, I'm not a doctor, I don't keep up on this, that Tykerb, I believe, is always used, often used with another drug called Xeloda. So no mention of costs here. It took me, again, seconds on Google. I Googled cost impact of Tykerb and found this from a breast cancer discussion board from a woman who knows, because she has to take both of them, and she says it's $6,000 a month, and I didn't underline it, but the next line there is, I only make $1,000 more per month than that. Think of how many Missouri women are prescribed these drugs or urged to take these drugs and don't make anywhere near what this woman is complaining about. If you don't, I would tell this to an 8th grade journalism class, if you don't have your audience in mind, or to any of you writing news releases, or any messaging, if you don't have your audience in mind when you send a message, do not send it. So if you're writing about these metastatic breast cancer drugs and don't have a woman with breast cancer in mind and her pocketbook, you should not be doing this story. Now, sometimes we get close. So here was a story. There's a big move in urology, as some of you may know, for chemoprevention of prostate cancer. So they're taking drugs that worked in BPH. So here was a study looking at dutasteride. For whatever reason, the reporter didn't push the researcher for number needed to treat on dutasteride, but did get the numbers for a similar drug, finasteride. And what I've encircled here is they came really close. The cost per pill, The NNT was 71 men for 7 years. I'm sure some of you are smart enough to think, why didn't they take it to the next step and connect the dots? Because if they did, the headline wouldn't be drug lowers risk. It would be, gee, it would only cost $500,000 to prevent one case of prostate cancer that you maybe didn't even need to know about. One of our medical editors caught this, and it rocked my world. And I have not looked at a story like this the same ever since. Think of how we all are numb to this. And if you applied just that one more connect the dot to so many stories, we would have such a very different view of the information we get about wonderful new things in healthcare. Just like if we only said all screening tests cause harm, some also do good. Now, some people do an excellent job. Duff Wilson at the New York Times, I love this guy, and have no connection with him. And he may not have crunched the numbers, but he got a cardiologist who did. So, you know, we're all being encouraged to think about adding statins to the water supply. I don't want a magical touch on my prostate, and I don't want statins in my water supply. But he got a cardiologist to say that at $3.50 a pill for Crestor and the known number needed to treat, it would be a mere $638,000 to prevent one heart attack. Now, let me be clear. If that's my dad or my brother or me, I know I may think that's a bargain. But as a member of society, I think we have to start having a discussion about this. And we don't. And here's a forum where it could be done. But thank God for people like Duff Wilson. Former student of mine, I remember right where she sat. She had cancer. Her hair was coming back from her chemotherapy. And she saw this story. It was a well-intentioned story on NBC recently about Gleevec and the broader story of expensive new cancer drugs. But she was ballistic and wrote to me and said, gee, they reported it's a miracle, a cure, a marvel, but the story doesn't say anything about why on God's green earth any drug costs $5,000 a month. Oh, but they did mention that the Kind Pharma company will help people pay for it or find assistance, but unless that assistance brings the cost down to about $50 a month, it's not enough. If you're not plugged in to your audience, and a young woman like this, who is a cancer survivor, but as we all know, has a lifetime of issues ahead of her, you should not be communicating. I'm transitioning now to another important point. News is often based week in, week out. I remember when I worked at CNN, they wanted to cut our travel budget. You don't have to go anywhere, Gary. There's a different journal embargoed for every day of the week. So you could just meet your quota by staying at your desk. And then, I don't know, this has probably changed, but let's say Monday's New England Journal, Tuesday's JAMA, Wednesday's The Lancet, Thursday's BMJ, Friday's the CDC's MMWR. Well, there's a harm in letting journals be your steady diet. First of all, journalists treat this as if this is the endpoint. It's part of a continuing stream of science that continues downstream with different ebbs and flows. It's not the end of the story. Publication in the New England Journal does not mean this is ready to be written on stone tablets. We know about journals' publication bias in favor of positive findings over negative findings. And there's the sinister side to this, that besides advertising and subscriptions, which are declining, they make a hell of a lot of their money off reprints. And what's going to sell more, negative article reprints or positive? And journals also have different policies on disclosure of conflicts of interest. So I always tell journalists, just because you don't see it in there doesn't mean that it exists. And I don't think that a financial tie in and of itself besmirches the quality of the evidence. But again, we better begin to have a discussion in this country of what we are comfortable with and where we draw the line. I don't know if any of you read The Atlantic. This has been one of the leading thinkers in questioning relying on journals for our steady diet of news and information in healthcare. John Ioannidis, who's a Greek, he has an appointment at Tufts in Boston. This is an interesting article. I'd suggest you look it up. It's in this month's Atlantic. These are a couple of the things that he's written: why most published research findings are false, why current publication practices may distort science. Remember, my message is usually to journalists, and so I'm trying to get across to them, you need to broaden your horizons. You're given a rose-colored view of research progress if you simply rely on journals. Victor Montori at Mayo had this interesting article a couple of months ago about stoppage of randomized clinical trials, and he says, when this happens, everybody benefits except the patient, who may end up receiving a therapy on the basis of misleading information about its benefits. But that's a side to the story that is never told. Here was a study of studies and a study of animal studies, and I can't tell you how many stories we review that are simply based on animal research and fail to include anything about the limitations of such research. Woloshin and Schwartz at Dartmouth had this interesting study of what came of abstracts presented at scientific meetings that also got a lot of headlines at the time, ended up going nowhere in research progress, and yet there was never any refuting of that in the follow-up stories. So I just challenge journalists and all communicators to some of these questions. Why don't we spend more time communicating about the uncertainties that exist and the variations that Wenberg and company for now 40 years have shown us occur in healthcare? Why do we have fourfold variations across the country in the rate of coronary angiography? Are our arteries that different from Seattle to Miami? Why do we have a fivefold variation in the rate of back surgery? Sixfold variation in the rate of mastectomy versus lumpectomy and radiation for early-stage breast cancer. Does this really reflect women's interests? Why do we have a tenfold variation in the way we die and in what we spend on the way we die across the country? Does this reflect patient preference? There's a story here no matter where you live in this country, and whether you're in a high-use or a low-use area, because as Wenberg reminds us, we don't know what the right rate is, and we don't know that until we do a better job of plugging patient preferences into the equation. So this is just one of the pictures, the crazy quilt of U.S. healthcare that Wenberg says, destiny, geography is destiny in U.S. healthcare. How you get treated depends on where you live. This is a reflection of rampant uncertainty, and we should not run from this. So, I would just suggest that where there's uncertainty, we should ask, is this a reflection of physician preference or patient preference that will, or will it be a reflection of a shared decision-making environment? There are stories here wherever you live in this country. Instead, many stories on these topics act as if there's certainty when there really isn't. There never has been certainty about mammography in the 40s. So when these critics, or when women were allowed to say unchallenged last November, this came out of the blue and it was surprising, journalists have to have an institutional memory that this was almost a direct replay of the '97 NIH Consensus Conference, when indeed science was again hijacked by politics and the Consensus Conference was ordered to change what their recommendation was. There never has been certainty about back surgery, which is why we have the fivefold differences, about heart disease treatment, about prostate cancer treatment. We shouldn't run from uncertainty. We should discuss the quality of the evidence and the trade-off of benefits and harms that exist and engage patients in shared decision-making. Why don't we have more stories, for example, about this prostate cancer vaccine that costs $100,000 and the best evidence shows it extends life by 4 months. Again, if that's me, my brother, or my dad, I might say that's a bargain. We are not having a public discussion about these issues, though. Why don't we have stories about how a drug company promotes its $2,000 drug for diabetic eye problems rather than its $20 drug that may be just as effective? Why don't we have more stories about who pays when the medical arms race, as we talked about with proton beam proliferation, introduces medical marketing wars in a community? Why not more stories about med school conflict of interest policies? Why not more stories about a theme of today, social determinants of health? Why not more stories about who benefits from treating pre-disease or pseudo-disease? Why don't we have more stories about how celebrity health anecdotes may have no relevance in our lives? Why don't we have more stories about the clear pattern of ghostwriting in journal articles, especially most recently shown back with the hormone replacement therapy studies? Why don't we have more stories about industry funding of nonprofit health groups, or even of industry funding of journalists? I've been leading the charge on this. Pfizer has funded journalists' all-expense-paid fellowships to, quote, learn about cancer and Alzheimer's through the National Press Foundation in Washington for the last 2 years. Isn't it interesting? Cancer and Alzheimer's seems to be high on Pfizer's product line. And journalists who take this money stonewall you when you suggest that this is a problem. Why don't we have more stories about polls that show that patients do think that pharma has too much influence on prescribing? Why don't we have more stories about evidence that there's a pretty big difference between what doctors say and what patients hear? More stories about the lack of shared decision-making in many physician-patient encounters. The decision study has been published within the last month. It was a special issue of a journal, and especially in prostate cancer, the lack of shared decision-making in these encounters is appalling. So I would suggest that even in 300 words, journalists, or you in your news releases or on your websites, can help explain and help educate that in healthcare, more is not always better. Newer is not always better. That screening tests don't always make sense for everyone. We could do so much good. Journalists and all who communicate about health could help consumers become smarter, healthier skeptics. Or we could, and actually do, often commit harm. So thank you so much for your attention, and I think we have time for some questions.
Thank you, Gary, for that provocative talk. We have time for questions. I think here and then here. So you're first. Wait for the microphone, if you don't mind.
Now I'm nervous. Have you looked internationally? Is there any other media do any other countries have media that deal with this issue better than the United States does, or are we like the zenith of healthcare reporting?
That's a really good question, and I wanted to cover this. I stole all these ideas. It wasn't stealing, it was with permission. The pioneering effort was in Australia, a website called Media Doctor Australia. So if we're 5 years old, they're about 7 years old. And then just about the time we launched the US effort, a Media Doctor Canada site launched. Now, why did we call ours Health News Review? Americans always have to be different. But I also I was so sensitive about journalists being resistant and thin-skinned, and we're not going to get anywhere if we don't get through to them. But in the end, I really don't care about journalists. I care about the audience they serve. That I thought the name Media Doctor conveyed that something was broken and needed to be fixed. So, like Toys R Us, I believe in terms that say exactly what you are. And so we review health news, so we became Health News Review. So there's Australia, Canada, the US. I'm just consulting, I told you, with Germany, which is going to launch Mediendoktor DE for Germany next week. They'll call it the German Health News Review. And there's a lot of interest. There's an Italian journalist who has a grant to do this, and there is a Swedish journalist that I just saw in Amsterdam last month who wants my help. Now, I still didn't answer your question, and I'm not sure that I ever will. But I do know that many Europeans laugh at us, I think they laugh at us for our healthcare system. They laugh at us for our journalism. They laugh at how we promote screening tests. I've heard this. They are stunned about the stories that I show them on prostate cancer screening. Yet I gave a talk once, and there was a doc from the UK who stood up after a talk as long as this one and said, this is nothing compared to what we have in London. So what empowers me and makes me feel very gratified is that there's this strong international effort of these three predominantly English-speaking countries and now some others. And again, if we have a data-driven mirror that we can hold up in the US, if we ever pool, and we all use the same 10 criteria, if we ever pool our data, if we find time and ways to do this, what a powerful international message. So it wasn't in direct answer to your question, but it said what I wanted to say.
Hi. As a former healthcare journalist and former fellow of the Association of Healthcare Journalists, I nearly ran up and hugged you throughout your presentation.
Come on up.
I can't tell you how true what you have laid out here is. I would, though, add one thing to your list of harms. There is a false sense that, excuse me, that the medical arms races that we see in communities are actually a benefit to economic development. And in fact, they can be crushing to a community's business. And I now work on behalf of employers who try to provide better information to their employees on cost and quality of health care. And you know, I think, unfortunately, too often those who are trying to provide information on variation in care are perceived as anti-health care. And I know that that exists in the newspaper world, and I think that it exists in communities around our country, and I just really appreciate the work you're doing.
Well, thank you so much. One small reaction to what you said. I work with a lot of docs around the country all the time. So I work with docs in institutions that have acquired proton beam and IMRT and CyberKnives and on and on and on, stand-up MRI machines. And they tell me that they will, now you could argue this, but these are learned people on the inside who say, we won't recoup those costs for a long time. And so if it is framed as good for the local economy, I think you need to talk with people inside that organization first about how they're going to pay this off. Of course, we know that many of these devices will then run 24/7. If you build it, they will come. But you raise very valid questions, which I don't know why we don't have more news. But in the business section, as I briefly alluded to, it's like a whole different ethic in journalism, and we become cheerleaders far too often.
We actually had a section that was dedicated to what we called money and medicine, helping people understand the correlation between money and the quality of health care. And we could get no advertising from hospitals because they were afraid to be next to something that might question the investments that they were making. And the section is now about walking programs and corporate fitness, and it looks a lot different.
That's the light, fluffy consumer health news you can use that journalists complain to me about over and over.
Exactly.
That's sad.
How you doing, brother? I just wanted to tell you, I thought your presentation was great. And
You could hug me if you'd like as well.
Just two things I wanted to ask you. One, do you think what you presented creates, I guess you would say, maybe medical consumer apathy? And the second is, do you think you can win with all the money that's pumped into pharmaceutical drugs?
I'm always asked this. I was asked this yesterday in speaking to some public health students here. I am Pollyanna. I'm very idealistic. I actually quit a tenured faculty position at the University of Minnesota last May so that I could work on this full time because my academic responsibilities wouldn't allow me to do that. And it was the best decision I ever made. I wouldn't be doing this, and I wouldn't quit a tenured faculty position if I didn't think that this could make a difference. And I really want to, the folks here from, or have they left me, from the Association of Health? No. The Association of Healthcare Journalists is making such inroads. I believe they're a quality improvement leader in all of journalism. It's based here at the University of Missouri, if you're not familiar with that. I was a 2-term board member. I'm joined at the hip with them. I just wrote a guide for them with some Robert Wood Johnson money they got. I don't think you... And so I think there is reason for optimism. And don't skirt over what my opening slide said in that Bartlett quote, the Pulitzer winner, that we've never seen better investigative healthcare journalism. We all, it's incumbent on us, I challenge every audience, when you see schlock, when you see crap, when you see inaccurate, imbalanced, incomplete, harmful news, you are obliged to let that newspaper know about it. Meet with that editorial board. Otherwise, they go home thinking they did a good job because they didn't get any negative feedback. They don't do this maliciously. So if you don't do that, I'd say you're getting exactly what you deserve by being one of the silent majority.
Can I just say, many of you know I'm a dermatologist, and this may seem a shock to you, but anti-aging treatments in this country are a $9 billion industry, and there is widespread resistance to the notion, get ready for this, people basically look their age.
As a dermatologist, how do I look to you?
Well, you look your age, but dandruff is kind of a disease.
Do you have a pill to put in my water supply?
No, but I can help you with that. I'm sorry. Okay. Wait, right here, Nick.
Thanks a lot, Gary. I really agree with all that you said, too. But what do we do? I want your opinions on the fact that some recent research at the University of Michigan, political science, found that when presented with facts, people often dug in their heels deeper, and because of the cognitive dissonance, and particularly around political partisanship. I mean, it was pronounced in that. So how do we deal with that? I mean, you're talking about giving facts, but what do we have to do to prepare the civic lessons to accept that?
You know, Jack Wenberg is still my mentor, and I've cried on his shoulder a bit within the past year about making more progress with what we're doing. And, he couldn't get his shared decision-making work published. In 1973, it was rejected by JAMA, rejected by the New England Journal, rejected by everybody, had to publish it in Science, which was not a normal place to publish that kind of work. So when Wenberg, with that track record, says to me, Gary, be patient. This is a paradigm shift. It's hard for me to accept that because I'm impulsive, but I do take that advice. And you're bucking years and years of training and thinking. I mean, we were all brought up hearing the Cancer Society slogan, fight cancer with a checkup and a check. Well, the second part of that is not always an evidence-based statement for all of us. But to try to buck that, to try to even raise this issue that there can be a harm from a screening test. I'm not a doctor. I don't have to sit with patients and try and do this. So I'm so sympathetic to, having that clock ticking for your limited time with a patient and having to educate on issues like this. But I think we do have more voices that are getting involved, and we have to start chipping away. I don't think, you heard me talk about this yesterday, you were in that talk, I don't think we've ever had a good test, in the news arena only I'm talking about, of what I always call a diet of hot fudge sundaes versus a diet of broccoli. We only give hot fudge sundaes. I knew what I was glued to the screen when OJ was in the runaway white Bronco. I was not proud of myself, but that is my base human instinct, and so were many of you. On that day, we weren't given a choice, nor were we before that or after, of a little broccoli. And I believe we have to, just as in nutrition education, in nutritional journalism education and health communication, I believe we need to start to inject a little more broccoli every day into the discussion. That was my closing slide, that even in 300 words, think of the good we could do if once a month, much less once a week, much less every day, somewhere started to inject these important themes, we would have a much different discussion beginning in this country.
Okay. Last question over here. Yeah.
What role does direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising play in the editorial decisions that are made in magazines? I know after 30 years of practicing family medicine, the waiting room magazines seem to be chock full of drug ads compared to the ones that you get at home, the same magazines. What effect does that have in the long run?
You know, and you may think that I'm naive. I am so slow to consider that there actually could be that big a gap in the supposed wall between editorial and advertising. I don't think it exists in any, but perhaps a handful of newspapers in this country. I do think that that wall has been torn down in TV news. We have paid for health segments by medical centers and by industry all over the country. And this is one of these times when I wish I weren't doing all this other stuff, because I surveyed a bunch of journalists across the country, including some magazine folks, for a report for the Kaiser Family Foundation last year on the state of U.S. health journalism. And magazine writers, especially freelancers, really wanted to tell me stories about what you're raising, about the magazine world. And yet, they didn't want to go on the record. And in fact, the more I probed, the more they got skittish and held back. There clearly is something there that's very troubling. And the public, the readers, the viewers just don't know.